Hello and welcome to The Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today I'm looking at the 2009 to 2010 series, Spider-Man Noir, Eyes Without a Face. With Marvel pushing their new Noir line of comics, only a few months had passed between the end of the first Spider-Man Noir story and the start of this one. And, appropriately, the story takes place only a few months after the previous story ended, and fulfills the promise from the end of the last one to take a look at Nazis and Dr. Otto Octavius. But with this Spidey's origin story fully out of the way, it also allows itself some time to better explore its universe, get to know its characters, and face some appropriate social issues of the time, which, rather depressingly, are all too eerily similar to social issues we are facing today, like the inexplicable growth of white nationalism or the treatment of black people as less human or less important, even by those whose intentions are to protect. So let's shed some light on these dark streets and take this away. The comic opens with a stoolie being dumped at the feet of some G-Man at the Federal Building. Actually, that old-timey slang sounds like something much grosser than it is by today's standards. Okay, let's try this. This dead guy? He was a snitch, and that money stuffed in his mouth is what he was paid for his insights by this guy, a gender-bent Jean DeWolf. Yeah, they took one of Spidey's strongest, best female side characters and turned her into a him. I mean, I get it. This is set in 1933. There's no way a woman could be a cop at this time. But there's also no way a man can spit webs from his hands, so, balance. I would have appreciated that if they did work her character into the story somehow, they would have found a way to keep her female and have it make sense. That's all I'm saying. That's certainly the case with this version of Robbie Robertson, who is still black. They didn't feel the need to make him white so he could fit into the story. As a black man in the early 30s though, he certainly couldn't work for an institution like the Daily Bugle, certainly not in any position of power, but he's still a newsman, now working for a paper called The Negro World, which would be a pretty offensive name by today's standards. Robbie and his father Carver are good friends with the Parkers, and when they come to visit, Robbie expresses his dissatisfaction at the bare minimum amount of news they're allowed to cover at the World. This particularly stems from the fact that they attempted to interview Dr. Otto Octavius in his new lab under Ellis Island, but Octavius had no time for them. So he convinced Peter to convince the Bugle to do a story on Octavius, and suddenly the Doctor has more time for the press. So Peter takes Robbie as his assistant, and the two tour the Ellis Island lab, meeting first Noir Kurt Connors, who seems mostly like regular Connors, even missing his arm, and then Noir Octavius, who is pretty different. This Octavius grew up in German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, and was born with a congenital leg condition that kept him in a wheelchair. His family owned a copper mine there, and their large plantation was run mostly by natives, all of whom young Ock saw as lazy and degenerate. What? They're playing a game? And kissing in their off time? Kissing? How awful! How absolutely terrible! So, Ock grew up with his only friend, science, developing this horrifying nightmare chair covered in mechanical arms. He also started attempting to unlock the secrets of the human brain, as he shows to Pete and Robbie by experimenting on monkeys. Robbie is rightfully horrified by what Octavius is doing, though Peter says, it's just a monkey. But there's more reason for Robbie's horror, as we soon learn. It turns out that Robbie's interest in Octavius has little to do with the actual science and more to do with explaining the disappearance of various black people from the streets of New York. It seems Octavius is experimenting on more than monkeys. He's been kidnapping black people and subjecting them to horrible mind surgeries in order to create the perfect slave. One with no will to resist, but still all the cognitive capacities to perform their simple tasks and understand commands. Oh, so this is the origin of the experiments from Get Out. To achieve this end, Octavius has been getting help from a group called the Friends of New Germany, a Nazi organization attempting to infiltrate American politics to spread their gospel of hate. A senator named Joseph Ansel is the one running the whole show, providing Ock with his laboratory and his specimens with the help of a lowly grunt turned masked supervillain called the Crime Master. The Crime Master is an old Lee Ditko spider villain who never amounted to much beyond briefly learning the identity of the original Green Goblin. His character here is a callback to that one. With the Goblin being killed off in the first story, Ansel sets up Crime Master as the new kingpin of crime for New York. taking control of all the old ganglands with the help of his bruiser, a man they call the Sandman, for dark reasons. Sadly, nothing is really ever explained about the Sandman. He's ridiculously strong, able to beat the crap out of Spider-Man, who describes punching him as being like hitting granite. When DeWolf and his men show up, they fill him with a hailstorm of lead before he finally dies. And that's pretty much all we see of the Sandman in this comic. The Crime Master isn't around much more either. He's mostly there to posture, declaring his power more than actually having any. He's completely subservient to Ansel, who sees him as an idiot and a liability, even ordering his death by the end of the comic. But CM starts believing his own press, trying to take everything that was the Goblins, and that includes Felicia. But Felicia isn't a woman to be owned, and she does her own thing. Spider-Man also tries coming to her at one point for help finding the Crime Master, early on when he still believes the Crime Master to actually be the one in charge. Felicia isn't interested in taking sides, but she is interested in taking some entertainment for the night, seducing Pete into her bed. Yowza. Of course, the next morning she gets all melancholy and kicks him out, despite Pete, still young, being clearly hopelessly in love with her. She tells him to go home and find himself a nice girl that he can get married to and settle down with. Then, you turn the page, and there's Mary Jane, saying, "Look what the cat dragged in." Nice. Okay, a little on the nose, but an enjoyable little wink to Spidey fans. Despite her complete rejection of him, Spidey still seeks her out the rest of the series, even going to her for help when he needs it, showing up to her place after the Sandman beats him to a bloody pulp. She cleans him up and lets him sleep over, but as always kicks him out the next morning. Unfortunately for her, later that day the Crime Master shows up for his usual visit, and when he's cleaning up afterward, he discovers the bloody towels and a bloody handprint on her balcony, and quickly realizes who's been stopping by. He pushes her around, slamming her against her mirror and breaking it. He then puts on his mask, picks up a shard of glass, and, well, you can guess. Man, that's messed up. He leaves, believing her dead, but she isn't. She manages to get to a phone and calls the police, informing them of the truth of Ock's lab under Ellis Island. This leads to the final showdown with all the characters at Ellis Island. Ansel has decided that too many people are getting too close to the truth, and not willing to risk his position, he has Crime Master shut down Ock's lab and get rid of all the evidence. Spidey, meanwhile, shows up there also, looking for Robbie, who's gone missing. In attempting to find out what Ock was really up to, Robbie got himself kidnapped and locked away in Ock's lab. Pete arrives and rescues all the kidnapped people, but he's too late to fully save Robbie, who has already been lobotomized by a drill straight to the frontal lobe, thanks to Ock. Man, that's messed up. Pete's forced to fight the Crime Master's men in order to help the prisoners escape, but Robbie, lacking willpower now, just stands there while the fight goes down. So Crime Master grabs him, threatening to slice his throat if Spidey doesn't back down, though he also foolishly taunts Spidey about having killed Felicia. But with the cops closing in, and tired of the Crime Master's blustering and the fact that he called him a filthy cripple earlier, Ock decides to back Spidey here and proceeds to cut up Crime Master the way he likes to cut up his victims. So once again, a Spider-Man Noir story concludes with Pete just standing by while a secondary villain kills the primary villain. Kinda not cool there, Pete. Ock expects to earn leniency thanks to his help here, but Pete doesn't plan on giving it to him, instead breaking his chair and starting to choke the life out of him. DeWolf shows up to stop him, calming him down by letting Pete know that Felicia is still alive. The comic ends with Robbie being returned home, but everyone learning that Dr. Octavius is not going to be punished for the evil he did, instead being extradited back to Germany. Peter is pretty disenchanted by this news, fearing a wave of evil coming to wipe away all the decent people in the world. Octavius gets a bit of that wave when he arrives in Germany and meets Heinrich Himmler. Himmler has no interest in Octavius due to his birth defect. Let that be a lesson to you, kiddos. Nazism never pays. We also see that Felicia takes to wearing a cat mask to cover her scars. Oh, eyes without a face. Now I get it. Let's get to the breakdown. Overall, I definitely found myself enjoying this comic more than the first one. There are some things that do bother me about it though. In particular, it's the way women are treated. Like Jean DeWolf being turned into a man, or Mary Jane becoming a bit of a shrinking violet, clearly in love with Peter though he doesn't notice her at all. Or, well, what they do to Felicia. But it does all kind of fit the theme. The whole story is about men obsessed with power who feel they deserve it but are mostly denied it and feel inadequate because of that. Like Octavius resenting the servants on their plantation because he couldn't have a normal life like them. or the crime master who believes he can live up to his name but is really just a pawn in someone else's game. Then all these people who were considered lesser humans at the time pay the price, Robbie and his family, and Felicia. Even Peter was more focused on his life and interests at greater cost to them. It's a surprisingly powerful issue story, wrapped up in what feels like an almost generic feeling noir mystery story. So that's why I'm giving this series a recommendation level of high. I definitely feel that it's more interesting than the first story, and that you don't have to read that one in order to read this one. Thanks everybody for watching! Unfortunately, due to my regular job, my schedule has gotten mixed up, so this third Spider-Man review is unfortunately going to be my final Spider-Man review for the month. Next week is a new month, and that means a new theme, one I'm also very excited about covering, so make sure you stick around to see that. Hope to see you then, right here in the Comic Cave.